Welcome to Warriors of the World. Today we'll be exploring the fascinating culture of the Dayak Headhunters of Borneo, indigenous warriors whose jungle fighting skills were so formidable that even modern armies sought their expertise. Subscribe now to join our community and support this project. Deep within the vast emerald rainforests of Borneo, the world's third-largest island, evolved one of history's most formidable warrior traditions, that of the Dayak peoples. The term Dayak encompasses over 200 distinct ethnic subgroups indigenous to Borneo, an island now politically divided between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. Despite their cultural diversity, these groups share certain warrior traditions that have fascinated and terrified outsiders for centuries, most notably their historical practice of ritual headhunting. The Dayak homeland consists of some of Earth's most challenging terrain, dense tropical rainforest characterized by towering dipterocarp trees, tangled undergrowth, winding rivers, and mountainous regions shrouded in mist. According to anthropologist Erik Hansen, who spent extensive time with Dayak communities during the 1970s, this environment shaped every aspect of Dayak warrior culture, from their weapons and tactics to their spiritual beliefs surrounding warfare. The forest was not merely the setting for their martial activities but an active participant in them, providing both resources and sacred significance. The diversity of Dayak subgroups creates considerable variation in specific warrior traditions. Anthropologist Bernard Celato, who has studied Bornean indigenous cultures for decades, identifies at least 6 major Dayak cultural-linguistic divisions, including the Iban, Kayan, Kenya, Ngaju, Bideu, and Murat, each with distinctive martial practices. The Iban of Sarawak, for example, were particularly renowned for their aggressive headhunting expeditions and earned the fearsome colonial-era label Sea Dayaks due to their river-raiding prowess, while the Kayan and Kenya developed elaborate social hierarchies with warrior aristocracies. Despite this diversity, certain common elements defined the traditional Dayak warrior. Historical accounts compiled by colonial administrator Charles Hose in the early 20th century describe warriors who combined intimate knowledge of forest environments with sophisticated weaponry and spiritual practices designed to enhance martial prowess. These warriors operated primarily within tribal contexts rather than as dedicated military classes, with most adult men expected to develop fighting skills while also participating in other subsistence activities like farming, hunting, and fishing. The traditional Dayak warrior's arsenal combined sophisticated knowledge of local materials with innovative designs perfectly adapted to jungle warfare. The most iconic weapon, documented extensively by ethnographer Michael Heppel, was the mandao, also called parang ilong by some groups, a distinctive sword or machete with a blade that widened toward the tip, creating a deadly cutting edge. These blades, often measuring between 60 and 70 centimeters in length, featured elaborately carved handles made from deer antler, bone, or exotic woods, frequently adorned with human hair trophies and decorative beadwork. What made the mandao particularly remarkable was its metallurgical sophistication. According to research by archaeologist Barbara Harrison, Dayak blacksmiths developed complex iron-smelting techniques that produced blades combining a hard cutting edge with a more flexible body, similar in concept to Japanese katanas. The blade's unique asymmetric design made it effective for both slashing through jungle vegetation and delivering devastating cuts in combat. Anthropologist Erik Hansen noted that experienced warriors could reportedly decapitate an enemy with a single strike, a critical capability for traditional headhunting practices. Complementing the mandao was the sumpit or blowpipe, a long-range weapon of remarkable precision. Ethnobotanist Wade Davis documented how these weapons, typically measuring 2 to 3 meters in length, were meticulously crafted from ironwood or other hardwoods, often requiring months of careful drilling to create a perfectly straight internal bore. The darts, fashioned from the lightweight wood of sago palm, were tipped with lethal poisons derived from the ipo tree, Antiaris toxicaria, or other toxic plants. Anthropologist Alfred Russel Wallace, who traveled extensively in Borneo during the 19th century, recorded being both impressed and disturbed by the deadly efficiency of these weapons, which could silently kill at distances up to 40 meters. Defensive equipment was equally sophisticated. Dayak shields, kliao, were typically carved from a single piece of lightweight but durable wood, often featuring distinctive paintings and carvings believed to provide spiritual protection. Anthropologist Hedda Morrison documented the complex symbolism of these shield designs, which frequently incorporated stylized human figures, powerful animal spirits, or abstract patterns that served both decorative and protective spiritual functions. Some warriors enhanced their defense with vests made from animal hides or, in certain regions, basic armor crafted from overlapping pieces of bark cloth or rattan. The production and maintenance of these weapons involved complex social dimensions. According to anthropologist Bernard Salato's research, blacksmithing was often a hereditary specialization surrounded by ritual prohibitions and spiritual practices. Warriors developed close relationships with their weapons, believing them to possess spiritual essence. Historical accounts compiled by colonial administrator Charles Hose describe elaborate ceremonies for newly forged mandau blades, sometimes including ritual feeding with blood to awaken their power. These practices reflected the Dayak understanding of weapons as more than mere tools. They were spiritually charged extensions of the warrior himself. The practice most strongly associated with traditional Dayak warfare, headhunting, was far more complex than the sensationalized accounts typically presented in colonial literature. According to anthropologist Robert Pringle, who conducted extensive research on Iban history and culture, headhunting functioned within an elaborate cosmological system where human heads possessed tremendous spiritual power. For many Dayak groups, particularly the Iban, heads were not merely trophies but vessels containing untapala, spirit force, that could be harnessed to enhance agricultural fertility, ward off disease, strengthen tribal security, and establish status within the community. The motivations for headhunting varied widely across different Dayak groups and historical periods. Anthropologist Derek Freeman, who lived among the Iban for many years, documented that headhunting expeditions might be undertaken to avenge previous attacks, secure territory, resolve tribal conflicts, enhance the prestige of young warriors, or fulfill ritual requirements for religious ceremonies. Among some groups, obtaining a head was a prerequisite for marriage or for achieving certain social positions. Historical records compiled by missionary Charles Hose indicate that in many regions, a man who had not taken at least one head was not considered fully adult and might face significant social limitations. Preparation for headhunting expeditions involved elaborate rituals. Anthropologist Benedict Sandin, himself of Iban heritage, documented how warriors would consult omens, make offerings to spirits, observe specific dietary restrictions, and undergo ritual purification before embarking. Shamans often played crucial roles, interpreting dreams and divinations to determine auspicious timing for raids. These preparations might continue for weeks before warriors, typically groups of 10 to 30 men, would finally depart on expeditions that could take them hundreds of kilometers from their home territories. The actual conduct of headhunting raids emphasized stealth and surprise. Military historian Judith Hyman notes that warriors would typically approach target villages before dawn, sometimes having scouted them days in advance. Rather than engaging in open combat, the ideal raid involved quick strikes to obtain heads before retreating into the forest. This approach minimized casualties among the attacking party while still achieving the primary objective, securing heads rather than territorial conquest or complete destruction of enemy communities. After a successful raid, returning warriors would be met with elaborate ceremonies. Anthropologist Otto Steinmeier documented how the heads would be specially prepared, cleaned, smoked, and decorated, before being formally welcomed into the community through complex rituals. Among the Iban, this often involved the Jampi Kepala, head feast, a celebration lasting several days where the newly acquired heads would be formally inducted into the community, with women playing essential ceremonial roles. These rituals transformed the head from enemy body part to community spiritual asset, marking the complete transition of its power from the enemy group to the victorious community. The combat tactics developed by Dayak warriors represent masterful adaptations to one of Earth's most challenging military environments, the tropical rainforest. According to military historian Stephen Turnbull, who has studied indigenous warfare throughout Southeast Asia, the Dayak approach to combat emphasized mobility, environmental knowledge, and psychological warfare rather than direct confrontation or territorial control. This tactical philosophy evolved specifically for the rainforest environment, where visibility is limited to mere meters, movement is constrained by dense vegetation, and conventional military formations prove impractical. Central to Dayak tactical success was their extraordinary environmental awareness. Anthropologist Eric Hansen, who traveled extensively with Dayak guides in the 1970s, documented their ability to move through seemingly impassable jungle with remarkable speed and silence. Warriors developed specialized skills for navigation without landmarks, tracking enemies through minimal disturbances in vegetation, and identifying natural resources needed for survival during extended campaigns. Unlike conventional armies that relied on supply lines, Dayak war parties could sustain themselves indefinitely in the forest, harvesting food, medicine, and materials for weapons and shelter as they moved. Ambush warfare formed the cornerstone of Dayak tactical approaches. Military historian Judith Hyman describes how warriors would identify natural choke points along trails or rivers, sometimes enhancing these positions with carefully concealed pit traps, spring-loaded spear mechanisms, or tripwires connected to noise-making devices that would reveal enemy positions. Rather than engaging in frontal assaults, Dayak fighters preferred to strike from concealment, using blowpipes to silently eliminate sentries before closing with mandao blades for devastating close-quarters attacks. River warfare represented another area of tactical sophistication. Anthropologist Derek Freeman documented how certain Dayak groups, particularly the Iban, developed specialized techniques for waterborne operations using traditional longboats. These craft could be portaged around obstacles, allowing war parties to appear unexpectedly on waterways where enemies believed themselves secure. British colonial records describe Iban warriors conducting raids hundreds of kilometers from their home territories using these mobility techniques, creating persistent security challenges for colonial authorities attempting to establish control over the vast island. Defensive strategies were equally sophisticated. Anthropologist Robert Pringle documented how traditional Dayak longhouses were designed with security considerations paramount, built on stilts with retractable ladders, sometimes surrounded by sharpened bamboo stakes, pangees, and positioned to maximize natural defensive features of the terrain. Some communities constructed elaborate defensive networks, with observation posts positioned in the forest and systems of auditory signals to rapidly communicate threat information across distributed settlements. These defensive systems evolved specifically to counter the ambush-based tactics preferred by rival Dayak groups. The arrival of European colonial powers in Borneo, primarily the British in Sarawak and North Borneo, now Sabah, and the Dutch in Kalimantan, initiated a complex period of transformation for Dayak warrior traditions. According to historian Uwe Keat Jin, colonial authorities viewed traditional headhunting and intertribal warfare as obstacles to economic exploitation and political control. Beginning in the mid-19th century, both British and Dutch administrations implemented increasingly strict prohibitions against headhunting, backed by punitive military expeditions against non-compliant communities. James Brooke, the first White Raja of Sarawak, exemplifies the complicated colonial approach to Dayak martial traditions. Historian Nicholas Tarling documented how Brooke simultaneously worked to suppress headhunting while recruiting Dayak warriors as auxiliaries for his own military operations. This contradictory policy reflected a pragmatic recognition of Dayak fighting prowess. Colonial authorities found it more effective to redirect these skills toward their own objectives than to eliminate them entirely. Similar approaches were adopted throughout colonial Borneo, with indigenous warriors increasingly incorporated into formalized police and border patrol units under European command. Despite these pressures, traditional warrior practices persisted, particularly in remote interior regions. Anthropologist Otto Steinmeier noted that colonial prohibitions often resulted in headhunting going underground rather than disappearing entirely. Some communities maintained warrior traditions through modified ceremonies that symbolically represented headhunting without actually taking heads, while others simply conducted raids in areas beyond effective colonial control. Historical records from Dutch administrators document periodic headhunting revivals during times of social stress or weakened colonial presence, indicating the resilience of these cultural practices. The outbreak of World War II and the Japanese invasion of Borneo in 1942 created a dramatic new context for Dayak warriors. As documented by historian Uwe Keat Jin, Japanese occupation forces treated indigenous populations harshly, committing numerous atrocities and disrupting traditional life. This mistreatment generated intense antipathy among many Dayak communities, creating conditions for their eventual alliance with returning Allied forces. The most remarkable chapter in this history began in 1945 with Operation Samut, when the Australian Z Special Unit parachuted small teams of operatives into Japanese-occupied Borneo to organize resistance forces. Military historian Judith Hyman extensively documented how these teams, led by anthropologist-turned-commando Tom Harrison in Sarawak, recruited thousands of Dayak fighters to gather intelligence, ambush Japanese patrols, and rescue downed Allied airmen. According to Harrison's own accounts, the Allied command made a calculated decision to temporarily suspend prohibitions against headhunting, effectively sanctioning its revival against Japanese troops. The results were devastating for Japanese forces. Anthropologist Peter Metcalf documented how Dayak warriors, combining traditional jungle skills with modern weapons provided by Allied operatives, conducted highly effective guerrilla operations. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain allowed them to track Japanese units through seemingly impenetrable jungle, while traditional ambush tactics proved as effective against modern soldiers as they had against tribal enemies for centuries. Japanese troops, already struggling with supply difficulties and tropical diseases, found themselves under relentless psychological pressure from warriors whose ancestors had perfected forest warfare over countless generations. For traditional Dayak warriors, combat existed within a comprehensive spiritual framework that imbued fighting with metaphysical significance. According to anthropologist Bernard Celatto, who has conducted extensive research among various Dayak groups, warfare was not merely a material contest but involved engagement with numerous spirits, ancestors, and cosmic forces. Understanding this spiritual dimension is essential for comprehending the psychological world of the Dayak warrior, whose martial effectiveness derived partly from absolute confidence in supernatural protection and guidance. Central to many Dayak spiritual systems was the concept of semengat or semengat, sometimes called Ayu among certain groups, a form of spiritual power or life force that could be accumulated, diminished, or transferred through various actions, including warfare. Anthropologist Robert Winsler documented how successful warriors were believed to possess exceptionally strong semengat, making them not only physically formidable but spiritually powerful. Headhunting directly connected to this concept, as the captured head contained the semengat of the defeated enemy, which could be harnessed through proper ritual procedures. Dream interpretation played a crucial role in Dayak warfare. Anthropologist Peter Metcalf noted that potential war leaders would often base critical decisions on dream omens, sometimes canceling planned expeditions if dreams suggested unfavorable outcomes. These weren't viewed as mere superstitions but as direct communications from spirits and ancestors providing tactical intelligence from the supernatural realm. Historical accounts compiled by Charles Hose describe instances where entire war parties returned home without engaging in combat due to unfavorable dreams experienced by respected shamans or war leaders. Specialized shamanic practitioners often accompanied war parties, performing continuous spiritual work to ensure success. Anthropologist J. Bernstein documented how these individuals, whose titles varied among different Dayak groups, would conduct divinations using animal behavior, smoke patterns, or the appearance of certain birds to gauge supernatural approval for tactical decisions. They also performed protective rituals, created spiritually charged objects for warriors to carry, and communicated with various spiritual entities believed to influence the outcome of combat. Amulets and charms formed an important component of the warrior's spiritual arsenal. Anthropologist Eric Hansen observed numerous types of protective items, from small pouches containing specific plants, stones, or animal parts to specially prepared tattoos believed to turn weapons aside or make the wearer invisible to enemies. Some warriors underwent ritual scarification or consumed substances thought to create supernatural protection against specific weapons. These practices reflect a worldview where physical protection was inseparable from spiritual armament. The legacy of Dayak warrior traditions continues to resonate through multiple dimensions of contemporary life in Borneo. According to anthropologist Victor King, while actual headhunting has been effectively eliminated for generations, the cultural memory and symbolic significance of warrior traditions remain powerful forces in Dayak identity formation. Traditional weapons like the mandao have transformed from battlefield tools to important cultural symbols, prominently featured in community ceremonies, political events, and artistic expressions throughout Borneo. Occasional revivals of headhunting during periods of ethnic tension demonstrate the latent power of these traditions. Anthropologist Judith Hyman documented how during the violent conflicts between Dayak and Majorese transmigrant communities in West Kalimantan during 1997 and 98, some instances of ritual headhunting occurred. Similarly, journalist Tim Hannigan reported cases during the ethnic violence in central Kalimantan in 2001. These episodes, while limited and condemned by most contemporary Dayak leaders, indicate how dormant warrior traditions can resurface during periods of extreme social stress, particularly when communities perceive existential threats to their land and way of life. The relationship between warrior heritage and contemporary indigenous rights movements represents a more constructive adaptation. Anthropologist Anna Lowenhaupt Singh has documented how symbols and narratives drawn from warrior traditions frequently appear in Dayak political activism, particularly in contexts of resistance against logging, plantation development, and other extractive industries threatening traditional territories. The historical image of the Dayak warrior defending community lands provides powerful metaphorical resources for contemporary environmental and indigenous rights advocacy. Tourism and cultural performance have become important venues for the expression of warrior heritage. Anthropologist Eric Crystal noted the prominent featuring of warrior dances, weapon demonstrations, and other martial elements in cultural shows throughout Borneo. These performances serve multiple functions, generating income through cultural tourism, fostering pride in traditional skills among younger generations, and creating spaces where aspects of warrior tradition can be maintained without the actual violence of historical practice. Military applications of traditional Dayak knowledge continue in limited contexts. Journalist Pat Fahey reported that both Malaysian and Indonesian Special Forces units occasionally incorporate elements of traditional jungle survival and navigation techniques into their training programs, acknowledging the continued relevance of indigenous knowledge for operations in tropical forest environments. These programs represent a formalized continuation of the knowledge transfer that occurred more organically during World War II operations. The Dayak Headhunters thus represent far more than exotic historical curiosities. Their traditions exemplify how indigenous martial systems evolve in specific environmental and cultural contexts, how warrior practices intersect with spiritual beliefs to create integrated cosmological systems, and how martial traditions can adapt to radically changing circumstances while maintaining core cultural elements. In studying these historical warriors, we gain insights not only into a fascinating chapter of military history, but into the remarkable adaptability of human cultural systems in the face of extraordinary challenges. Subscribe now, become a member, turn on notifications, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment so we can compare our knowledge and sources. Thank you for following our channel. Until our next strategic journey, here at Warriors of the World.